Welcome to Heresy Financial, everybody. My name is Joe Brown, and recently, over the past couple of days, there's been a lot of news coming out about what's happening between China and Hong Kong right now. China announced that they would be enacting a national security law over Hong Kong, which news sources are saying is essentially the end of Hong Kong as an autonomous nation, as a sovereign state. Now, historically, Hong Kong and China have operated under something called one country, two systems. This is something that was put in place after the UK gave the colony of Hong Kong back to China and they were granted independence. But it wasn't a typical historical independence because China has always seen Hong Kong as belonging to itself and not its own independent, isolated nation. This has been the main driver of volatility, especially in international financial markets. And whenever something like this happens, it's really helpful to zoom out and look at things from a historical perspective. And I'm not talking the last 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. I'm talking thousands of years. As Winston Churchill said, those who do not study history are destined to repeat it. And when viewing events like this in light of historical patterns that take place over hundreds and thousands of years, it's really helpful to be able to see from a bird's eye perspective how things might unfold. This is more fuel on the fire in the overall play that's playing on the global stage right now, which is the rise of China versus the fall of the United States of America. And in financial markets, nobody has been more attuned to what is going on between those power dynamics between these two global powers than billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio. For the last few years at least, he's been intensely studying history from a long perspective, thousands of years. And so today we're going to look at some recent things that he has been saying about these dynamics to give us an idea of how these might play out and how it might impact financial markets. Let's dive in. Ray Dalio is a billionaire. He's the founder and manager of Bridgewater Associates, one of the most successful hedge funds of all time. It's currently the biggest hedge fund. And over the last couple of years, he's dedicated a large portion of his time to studying and writing history. Now, one of his skills is to be able to study a large portion of history and then distill all of the data points that he finds and all the information that he's consumed and create what he calls archetypes. Now, he did this in his book called Big Debt Crises, specifically with the archetypes or the models, the types of debt crises that usually hit. What he is now doing is studying the rise and fall of great powers built off the work of people like Paul Kennedy, Graham Allison. They've got great books. I'll link all of the relevant material sources, books in the description below if you want to go deeper on any of this material. But if you distill the rise and fall of great empires over the last thousands of years, and we can just look at the past 500 or 600 years, you start to encounter a general model of what happens over the lifetime of an empire. Now, the one that's going to be on most Americans' minds is obviously going to be the rise of America as a superpower, which took place at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. During this change of global powers, the United States replaced Great Britain as the global superpower, as the empire that held most power globally. Now, I'll throw a chart up here on the screen. This is a general model that organically appears when a new world power enters the scene. It starts off with a new world order, which is followed by peace, prosperity, productive debt growth, or just productive growth without debt, followed by a debt bubble, along with a giant wealth gap. And you can see right about here, you've reached kind of the peak of the empire. After the peak, you have the bubble bursting, an economic downturn. You have the empire trying to fix those problems through monetary debasement, printing money. Historically, that would be clipping coins or diluting the gold value in the coins. You then start to have greater problems, revolutions, wars, large restructuring then follows of massive debts and political power. And right about that time, those things have been the catalyst for the next world power to come onto the scene. And globally, power has now shifted into the hands of the new empire. Now, typically, this cycle will take 100, 200 years, but we can see here, plotting the data points and the historical information from the last couple of global empires, how this has played out and which empires have risen during which times. You can see that back in the 1500s, it was actually China who was the global superpower. And as that was coming to an end and the wars were breaking out and that cycle was shifting, you then had the Netherlands rise up. The cycle repeats itself. The next great power was the UK, whose power was then replaced by the United States. And we can see here that over the last 50, 60 years or so, the power of the United States of America has been dropping versus the rise of China. And it's important to notice here that no other country has come close right now. For a more simplified chart, check out this one, which only shows the most powerful reserve currency nations instead of all the other nations that were involved in the last one. Okay, that's a fantastic looking chart, but how are they measuring this? Specifically Ray Dalio, how is he determining what counts as a power rising, falling? How are things measured? Well, let's take a look at this chart. There are 8 factors that are measured in determining the power and global influence of a nation. Things like education, trade, innovation and technology, GDP or global output, productive output, competitiveness, that country being the financial center of the world, the power of the military and the reserve currency status. Now, it's important to notice here that in general, this is an average of all of the last dozen or so empires around the world. Some of these factors precede others. Something like education is one of the earliest to show up, which makes sense. If you've got a country which has one of the best education systems in the world and you have the smartest population in the world, that will lead to some of the other things happening, like innovation and technology, which would lead to greater financial output, which would lead you to being a financial hub or center globally. The wealth would give you the ability to build up a greater military, and then the combination of a lot of these factors would naturally lead your currency to have the favored or the most trustworthy position globally. So that it kind of makes sense, the flow of these factors. It's important because most Americans either don't want to realize this or don't know that the actual data shows what is really happening right now, that America's power, when measured across all of these factors, has actually been in decline over the last 50 years, and the only contender has been China. And they are closing in quickly. Now, as Graham Allison points out in Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides's Trap? Whenever power dynamics like this are changing, there is a great chance for war. And that's not the point of this video, but it's important to point out because when these dynamics are changing, allegiances around the world change. Case in point, what is happening right now with Hong Kong and China. Hong Kong has historically been aligned with the West, specifically the USA. They have been a hub of freedom in Asia. By most metrics, they have fantastic rule of law, fantastic business freedom, investment freedom, but they've never really been seen that way by China. Historically, that hasn't been too much of an issue, but as China has gained influence and power around the world, they've now taken the step to try and erase the autonomy of Hong Kong. And even more so, which isn't in the news right now, but even more so, Taiwan. They will not even recognize the existence of Taiwan as an independent nation. I'm sure most of you saw the video clip where one of the leaders of the World Health Organization was recently being interviewed over Skype about the coronavirus, and he was asked about the measures that Taiwan had been taking, and the WHO representative would not even acknowledge the question. He pretended like he didn't hear the question because she asked about Taiwan, and WHO is so heavily influenced by China that they are not allowed to recognize that Taiwan even exists as an independent nation. And when asked about the question one more time, he actually just ended the call.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership? Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
Now, one of the reasons for this, and I don't claim to be any expert geopolitically or especially on the history or the people or the culture of China, and so everything that I'm talking about here, I've just basically gathered from the books and the people that I've studied and read. One thing I do know though is that China actually means Middle Earth or Middle Kingdom or Middle Country, Middle Nation. And it's not talking horizontally as in geographically, as in being in the center of the world. Middle it is referring to, they are the nation or the state or the country or the land that is in between heaven and earth. So China views itself basically as the intermediary between the divine and the rest of the world. They're the Pope of the nations, if you will. And so it's no wonder that people in Hong Kong, lawmakers in Hong Kong, are saying this basically feels like the end of Hong Kong as an autonomous nation, as a sovereign state, because if a foreign country can come in and enforce a security law on us, there's no sovereignty here. We are basically now just part of China. There are no longer two systems. Now, financially, this is a big deal. US lawmakers have been now looking to enforce some sort of repercussions on China for doing this, which could come up in the form of sanctions, tariffs, or actually delisting and outlawing investments in Chinese stocks. Now, this is a topic for another video, but when viewed through the evidence and viewed empirically, there's always a better argument to be made for freedom over coercion. Whether it's taxes, whether it's investing, whether it's business regulations, whether it's social regulations, the best outcomes are always achieved when you err on the side of freedom and liberty rather than coercion and control. And so if America responds with more regulations, outlawing things, and in general moving towards less liberty rather than more, that's the wrong direction. And to be quite frank, one of the only reasons that China has been able to get into the position that they are in is because of the lack of freedom that America has had over the last 50 years, the abuse of their financial power over the last 50 years, which has allowed China to take advantage of these mistakes. But it looks like that is the direction that our leaders, our political leaders, are moving towards, which number one will create more volatility in the financial markets. It's almost impossible to be able to determine how things like that will play out when different stocks are delisted and it's made illegal for certain types of investors to invest in foreign investments, even if it is just something like government pension funds. But one thing is certain, that if there is more volatility, that will give the Federal Reserve and our government more reason for more stimulus, especially in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, which again, paradoxically, which I've talked about before, should lead to more buying pressure for domestic stocks. And so that should send American stock markets even higher. If there's more global volatility and money being shifted from international stocks by law into domestic stocks and more stimulus money being pumped into the economy, that should send United States assets higher. I've linked all the information that I've talked about in the description below, the books that I've referenced, Ray Dalio's article. So check those out if you want more. One note before I close up here, I will be traveling for the next week or so, and so my videos will not be as consistent. They'll be a little bit more sporadic over the next week or so, and obviously I'll be filming in different locations here. And so I apologize in advance for the quality, whether it's lighting, audio, editing, whatever it is. I'll still try and put out as much content as I can, depending on my internet access, because crazy things are happening and I want to keep you guys updated. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit that like and subscribe button. It really does help the channel out, and I appreciate you guys. Have a great day.